There comes a point in almost every seeker's life when the silence becomes unbearable. The prayers feel empty, the books repetitive, and the words of teachers begin to sound hollow. You've done everything right. You've meditated, you've prayed, you've believed, and yet, there's this quiet ache that asks, where is God in all this? And it's in that moment, when the heart grows tired of trying, that many people walk away from spirituality altogether. Not because they stopped loving God, but because they could no longer find Him in the noise of their own seeking. But before you give up, before you let go of the one thing your soul has been reaching for since the beginning of time, you need to understand something profound. You need to know that what you're truly longing for is not out there in the heavens, not hidden in a temple, not waiting in the next practice or the next revelation. It's been here, within you, quietly waiting for you to stop searching long enough to notice. You see, spirituality is not about adding something to your life. It's about removing everything that stands between you and the awareness that life itself is divine. The peace you've been chasing is not a reward. It's a recognition. And the moment you stop seeking it as something distant, you begin to live it as something present. So before you walk away from the path, before you declare that spirituality has failed you, stop. Because it hasn't failed you. It's trying to free you. What's collapsing is not your faith, but your illusion of control. What's dying is not your connection to God, but your concept of what God should be. And once that falls away, what remains is truth. Still, silent, radiant. The same truth that was there before you began your search, and the same truth that will remain when the search ends. You know, one of the most overlooked truths on the spiritual path is this: most people don't give up because they've seen the truth and rejected it. They give up because they've been chasing a shadow of it. They've been trying to live spirituality as an idea, as a system of belief, as a technique for improving the human condition. And when those forms fail to produce peace, they assume spirituality itself has failed. But the failure isn't in the spirit. It's in our misunderstanding of what spirituality actually is. We are conditioned to approach everything with the logic of cause and effect. If I do this, I'll get that. If I pray, I'll receive. If I meditate, I'll find peace. And that same mentality gets projected onto the infinite. We start treating the divine as though it were some distant being who must be persuaded, convinced, or impressed. We think if we just say the right words or perform the right ritual, God will respond. But that's not spirituality. That's transaction. And the moment spirituality becomes transactional, it loses its power, because the spirit doesn't operate in the currency of effort. True spirituality isn't about results, it's about realization. It's not about getting something from God, but awakening to what already is God. When you're seeking peace, you assume it's absent. When you seek light, you're affirming darkness. The paradox is that the very act of striving keeps you from experiencing what's already present. The mind says, I must find the truth. But the moment you stop searching, the truth quietly reveals itself, because it was never lost. This is why so many sincere seekers eventually feel spiritually frustrated. They've prayed, they've studied, they've tried every method under the sun, and still, there's a sense of emptiness. And yet, that emptiness is not a mistake. It's the threshold. It's the moment when the old ways of trying can no longer carry you forward. The personal self, the one that's been doing all the seeking, begins to wear out. And that exhaustion is holy. It's the beginning of surrender. When you reach that place where you can honestly say, I don't know anymore, something within you softens. The struggle loosens its grip, and in that quiet defeat, something extraordinary happens. Awareness begins to shine by itself. Not because you called it, not because you earned it, but because it's your natural state. The ego tries to reach God through effort. The soul meets God through stillness. You see, spiritual frustration isn't failure, it's purification. It's life stripping away your illusions about how the divine should appear. It's the gentle dismantling of your personal agenda so that you can finally experience presence without motive. Every disappointment, every unanswered prayer, every dry meditation, they are not punishments. They are invitations to move beyond the mind's idea of spirituality and into the living reality of spirit itself. And when that realization dawns, you understand something beautiful. There was never a moment when God wasn't here. It was only your mental noise, your striving, your expectations that kept you from noticing. Like waves on the surface of the sea, your thoughts created the illusion of separation. But underneath, the water was always still, always whole. So, before you give up, before you say, this path isn't working for me, pause and ask yourself, what version of spirituality am I trying to make work? The one that promises comfort, the one that fits my expectations, or the one that requires me to let go of everything I think I know? Because the real path isn't about finding peace. It's about becoming empty enough for peace to find you. And that's the secret most never reach. The moment you stop trying to make spirituality succeed for you, it begins to reveal itself through you. You see, one of the greatest confusions in the world today is the difference between religion and consciousness. Humanity has worshipped symbols for so long that it has forgotten what those symbols were meant to point to. Religion was never supposed to replace direct experience. It was supposed to prepare the mind for it. The tragedy is that many stopped at the form and never touched the essence. They memorized the words but never entered the silence from which those words were born. Religion, in its purest sense, can be a beautiful thing. It gives language to the ineffable and community to the seeker. It offers sacred stories, moral structure, and practices that help us live with greater harmony. But when religion becomes an end in itself, when it replaces the living presence with doctrines and rituals, it begins to separate rather than unite. The letter of truth remains, but the spirit behind it is forgotten. And then, instead of awakening consciousness, we start defending concepts. Consciousness, however, is not bound by any creed, culture, or scripture. It doesn't belong to one teacher or one tradition. It is the awareness through which all of these expressions are seen. When Joel Goldsmith said that the kingdom of God is within you, he wasn't offering a poetic metaphor. He was pointing to a literal reality. He was saying that the divine presence you seek exists in the quiet core of your own awareness, not in the external forms you worship. But the human mind resists that idea because it wants certainty. It wants to hold God like an object, to define, categorize, and manage the infinite. And so it clings to outer forms: a place, a book, a symbol, a belief. Yet the moment we confine the infinite to form, we lose its living essence. The truth cannot be contained in a concept any more than the ocean can be captured in a cup. This is why so many become disillusioned with spirituality. They mistake intellectual knowledge for realization. They collect teachings the way others collect possessions, storing sacred quotes, repeating affirmations, reading endless books, all in the hope that information will one day transform into illumination. But consciousness doesn't awaken through accumulation, it awakens through awareness. You cannot study your way to God. You can only awaken to the God that is studying through you. The shift happens the moment you stop reaching outward and begin turning inward. When you stop asking, "What must I do to reach God?" and instead begin to quietly observe, "What is this awareness that is asking?" That's when religion transforms into revelation. The outer becomes inner, and you realize that every sacred text was never meant to lead you to a distant heaven. It was designed to point you back to the still center within. That inner awareness, once touched, changes everything. You begin to see that prayer isn't about asking, it's about listening. Meditation isn't an escape from the world, it's an entrance into reality. Worship isn't bowing before something higher, it's recognizing that what you are bowing to is already within you. Religion gives you the map, but consciousness is the journey itself, the lived experience of the truth that cannot be written or spoken, only known in silence. And this realization doesn't destroy religion, it fulfills it. It redeems it from mere ritual and restores it to its rightful purpose, to awaken the soul to its own divine origin. Once you've seen that the same presence that inspired every prophet, saint, and mystic also breathes through you, the idea of separation dissolves. You stop belonging to a religion and begin belonging to life itself. So if your faith has grown cold, if you've begun to doubt the path, perhaps it isn't faith that has failed. Perhaps it's simply waiting to evolve. The moment you lift your eyes from the outer symbols and turn inward toward the light of awareness, you'll find that nothing was ever missing. The divine was never far, only forgotten. There's something deeply unsettling about silence. We live in a world that equates noise with meaning and activity with purpose. When the noise stops, when the activity fades, most people feel lost, as if the absence of movement means the absence of life. And yet, it's within that very silence that the essence of all true spirituality resides. The silence most people avoid is the very doorway they are searching for. It's where the mind ends and the infinite begins. You see, silence is not the absence of sound. It's the absence of resistance. It's that space within you that remains untouched, unbothered, unbroken by whatever is happening on the surface of life. But because the ego thrives on reaction and control, it interprets silence as emptiness, as if nothing real could possibly live there. That's why the moment we sit in stillness, the mind begins to chatter. It says, "This is useless. Nothing's happening. I'm wasting time." What's actually happening is that the ego is dissolving, and it knows it cannot survive where thought has no authority. Most people approach silence as a technique, a way to calm the mind, reduce stress, or achieve enlightenment. But true silence isn't something you practice, it's something you remember. It's the natural state beneath all thought. When you stop chasing experiences, stop labeling sensations, and simply allow yourself to be aware without agenda, You begin to feel a stillness that isn't created, it simply is. That stillness is the presence of God before it takes form. It's the foundation of every miracle, every healing, every moment of peace. Now, it's important to understand that this silence is not sterile. It's not a void or a dead space. It's alive, intensely alive. The mind calls it emptiness, but the soul knows it as fullness. Within that silence, you discover that life is self-sustaining. You don't have to make the heart beat. You don't have to make the sun rise. You don't have to make consciousness happen. It already is, and in that recognition, all striving ceases. But here's the challenge: we've been trained to fear stillness because we associate it with loss. The loss of identity, of control, of direction. Yet what is really being lost in silence is illusion. The illusion that you are separate, the illusion that life must be managed, the illusion that God is somewhere else. As these illusions fall away, something far more intimate reveals itself, a sense of being carried, of being lived. You begin to experience what Joel Goldsmith called the activity of the presence. A movement that isn't yours, yet flows through you effortlessly. And when you live from that awareness, your entire relationship to life changes. Prayer becomes less about asking and more about listening. Meditation stops being an exercise and becomes an atmosphere. You begin to sense that everything you thought was empty is actually overflowing with intelligence. That silence is not the absence of life, but the pulse of it. If you truly want to know the divine, you must be willing to enter that inner stillness without trying to use it for something. You can't go into silence with a goal and expect to meet God, because God is not an object to be obtained. God is the awareness that remains when all goals dissolve. The peace you find there is not a peace you achieve, but the peace that has been quietly waiting beneath every moment of noise. So when the world feels overwhelming, when prayer feels unanswered, when your spiritual practices no longer satisfy you, don't run from the silence, enter it. Sit there not as a seeker trying to get somewhere, but as awareness resting in itself. That's where revelation begins. The greatest illusion that humanity has ever believed is the illusion of separation. The idea that there is a here and a God somewhere else. That simple misunderstanding has caused more suffering than any outer condition ever could. It has turned the search for truth into a chase for something that was never missing. The moment you believe yourself to be separate from the infinite, you begin to live in a constant state of spiritual homesickness. Always reaching, always yearning, never arriving. And yet, the truth is far simpler and far more profound. You are not a fragment trying to return to its source. You are that source, expressing itself through the form called you. This isn't a poetic idea or a spiritual metaphor. It's the essence of every genuine awakening. The same life that beats your heart, that breathes your lungs, that moves the stars. That life is your own being. You are not living apart from it. You are living as it. Now, the human mind resists this truth because it thrives on division. It wants to be someone who achieves, someone who prays, someone who finds enlightenment. But awakening is not about becoming more. It's about realizing that there is no someone to begin with. The ego cannot grasp unity because it only exists through separation. And yet, when the ego begins to dissolve, something timeless begins to emerge, not as a concept, but as a living experience of oneness. You start to see that every act of love, every spark of intuition, every moment of peace was never you reaching upward. It was the infinite revealing itself through you. The flower doesn't strive to bloom. It unfolds naturally from the life within it. The wave doesn't try to find the ocean. It is the ocean taking shape. And so it is with you. The effort to become spiritual is like the wave struggling to find water. It begins and ends in illusion. When this realization dawns, something extraordinary happens. Fear begins to lose its power. How can you fear anything when you realize that everything arises within the same infinite consciousness that you are? Judgment softens because you begin to see yourself in others. Compassion becomes effortless because you no longer perceive distance between your life and theirs. You start to understand that life is not happening to you. It's happening as you. Joel Goldsmith often said that God does not come and go, God is. The presence is not something that visits you in moments of prayer or meditation. It's the constant background of all experience. The awareness in which your thoughts, emotions, and perceptions rise and fall. The problem isn't that you're far from God. It's that your attention has been fixed on the noise instead of the stillness behind it. To awaken, then, is not to climb a ladder to heaven, but to remove the blindfold that says heaven is elsewhere. The spiritual journey is not a path of addition but a subtraction. The gradual letting go of every idea that tells you you're separate from the very life that sustains you. When you stop believing those thoughts, you begin to sense something wordless, boundless, deeply intimate. You realize that what you've been calling my consciousness is in fact the same consciousness expressing itself through all of creation. And from that awareness, everything changes. Prayer shifts from asking to acknowledging. Gratitude is no longer a reaction to getting what you wanted. It becomes a natural state of being. You live with a quiet knowing that no matter what happens in form, gain or loss, birth or death, the essence of you remains untouched. You were never born, and you will never die. You are the awareness in which birth and death appear and disappear. So the next time you find yourself crying out to God, wondering where He is, pause and listen, not outwardly, but inwardly. Because what you are calling God is not outside the experience of your own being. It is the I that is aware of being. There comes a moment on every spiritual path when the light seems to disappear. The prayers that once brought comfort begin to feel empty, the words of Scripture lose their power, and the practices that once lifted you now fall flat. It's as if the heavens have gone silent. Many mistake this silence for abandonment, a kind of divine rejection. But this dark stillness, what mystics call the dark night of the soul, is not the absence of God. It is, in truth, His most intimate approach. When you reach this stage, it feels as though everything you once relied upon begins to crumble. The beliefs that gave you strength no longer satisfy. The ideas that inspired you begin to sound hollow, and the old images of God start to dissolve. This can be terrifying because the ego finds its identity and certainty in knowing what's true, what's right, what's safe. But spiritual maturity doesn't come from holding on to certainty. It comes from letting it go. The darkness is not a punishment. It's the dissolving of the false light, the artificial comfort that once hid the real. You see, before truth can reveal itself in its purity, everything that is untrue must fall away, and that process often feels like loss. The personal self feels empty, useless, disoriented, and that's exactly the point. The emptiness isn't the end of the path, it's the purification of the path. It's the undoing of all that stood between you and the direct realization of the infinite. Every illusion, every belief, every attachment that claimed to give you spiritual strength is stripped away, not to hurt you, but to free you from the idea that you ever needed it. This period of spiritual dryness is sacred, though it rarely feels that way. It is the point where God stops being an object to be found and begins to be revealed as the essence of your being. You're no longer sustained by outer practices or emotional highs. You are being drawn into direct awareness, pure, unmediated consciousness. The mind resists because it cannot define this stage. There are no techniques to apply, no doctrines to lean on, no teacher who can fill the silence for you. And yet this is precisely where grace does its quietest work. When you no longer find comfort in outer forms, you are being invited to discover the source within. You begin to realize that what you called faith was often dependence on feelings, on circumstances, on concepts of God that felt familiar. When those are removed, what remains is raw awareness, unfiltered presence. It's uncomfortable because it strips you of every illusion of control. But if you stay with that discomfort long enough, you begin to sense something subtle beneath the emptiness. There is peace. Beneath the silence, there is a quiet radiance, still, unmoving, eternal. That is when the dawn begins to break, not as an explosion of light, but as a quiet knowing. You start to see that the silence was not God's absence, but His fullness beyond your concepts. The emptiness was not void. It was the womb of new life. What you thought was an ending was actually the beginning of a deeper intimacy with the divine, one that no longer depends on outer reassurance or emotional experience. It is the birth of awareness itself. So if you find yourself in that silent space, if you feel like everything sacred has slipped away, don't rush to escape it. Don't try to fill it with noise or comfort or answers. Sit in it. Let it strip you bare. For in that holy emptiness, the false self dissolves, and what remains is the presence that never left you. There comes a time on the spiritual journey when the seeker realizes that all the striving, all the effort, all the endless trying to reach God has led to exhaustion. And in that exhaustion, something begins to shift. You start to see that no amount of doing, no prayer repeated, no meditation perfected, no book studied, can ever bring you closer to what has never been apart from you. That's when the greatest truth begins to dawn. Spirituality is not a path of effort, but of surrender. Now, surrender doesn't mean giving up in defeat. It doesn't mean apathy or passivity. True surrender is an act of profound intelligence, the moment when the personal will bows before the infinite wisdom that has been guiding everything all along. It's the recognition that the self you've been trying to improve, to purify, to make worthy of God, was never the real you to begin with. The one who strives for enlightenment cannot awaken, because the striving self is part of the illusion. We've been taught from birth that life rewards control, effort, and mastery. In the material world, that may be true, but in the spiritual dimension, those very instincts become obstacles. You cannot control your way into peace, nor can you will yourself into grace. The more you try to make God happen, the more you affirm that He isn't already present. Surrender, therefore, is not something you do. It's what happens when the mind finally stops trying to run the show. When you reach that moment, something extraordinary unfolds. The same life that seemed to move against you begins to move through you. The conflicts that once consumed you lose their charge. You no longer feel the need to manipulate outcomes or chase experiences. You begin to sense that a quiet intelligence, one far greater than your personal reasoning, has been operating beneath every moment. That intelligence doesn't ask for your effort, it asks for your trust. And this surrender is not an event, it's a way of living. It means meeting each moment without resistance, allowing what is to be as it is. It means recognizing that every circumstance, whether joyful or painful, is an expression of the same divine order. You no longer fight to change life. You let life reveal itself through you. And in that letting go, you discover a paradox. Nothing has been lost, but everything becomes lighter. The ego fears surrender because it equates it with annihilation. It believes that if it stops controlling, it will cease to exist. And in a sense, that's true. But what takes its place is not death, it's life in its purest form. It's freedom. When the false self dissolves, what remains is awareness, vast, open, radiant, untouched by gain or loss, success or failure. That awareness doesn't belong to you. It is you. It's what's been witnessing every experience since the beginning. Joel Goldsmith often said that when the personal sense of self dies, the Christ consciousness is born, not as a concept but as a living reality. This isn't a mystical abstraction, it's a shift in perception. You begin to live not from effort but from alignment, not from will but from wisdom. And everything you do, your work, your relationships, your silence, becomes an expression of that inner stillness. You act, but you're no longer the actor. You love, but you're no longer the lover. Life moves, but you no longer claim ownership of its movement. This is what it means to live surrendered, to let go of the belief in, there is no longer you and God, no longer seeker and sought, no longer prayer and answer. There is only the infinite expressing itself as all that is. The mind can't grasp this, it can only rest in it. And the heart, once it surrenders to that truth, never longs again. So when you finally stop striving, stop pleading, stop trying to make the infinite conform to your will, something sacred begins to happen. The veil lifts, and you realize that there was never a distance to close, never a God to reach, never a soul to save. There was only the forgetting and the remembering. The forgetting of your own divinity, and the remembering that you and the divine were never two. And in that remembrance, peace arrives, not as something achieved, but as something revealed. The search ends, not in defeat, but in awakening.